Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching NewsX World. Let's first take a look at our top stories. Qatar said the latest Gaza ceasefire proposal very much is like the one that was proposed by the US envoy Steve Witkoff, as Israel now studies a deal for a 60-day truce and the release of half of the remaining hostages after Hamas agreed to it on Monday. Meanwhile, the UN Human Rights Office warned that Israel is not allowing enough supplies into Gaza to avert widespread starvation. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says the country is already working on concrete security guarantees in the case a ceasefire is agreed, as Trump pushes for a direct Trump-Zelensky meeting. This comes as Ukraine's foreign minister says Russian overnight attacks show it is critical to end the war. Meanwhile, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov declared that any meeting between presidents of Russia and Ukraine to resolve the conflict must be prepared very thoroughly. Also, he has emphasised Ukraine's peace deal must guarantee Russia's security and the rights of Russian-speaking people in Ukraine. His remarks follow the high-level talks on Sunday. This comes as China say they are not party to the Ukraine crisis, as meetings between European leaders are scheduled after the talks between the US, Ukraine and Europe in Washington. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer is set to co-chair a coalition of the willing meeting as Germany's Chancellor is talking with the European Council President. Pierre Poilievre has won a special election in Alberta, returning to Parliament after losing his seat in the April elections. Poilievre, who accuses the Liberal government of mishandling relations with Washington, will confront Mark Carney when the House of Commons resumes next month. Meanwhile, Air Canada and the Canadian Union of Public Employees, representing 10,000 flight attendants, have now concluded their 4-day strike after reaching a tentative agreement. Air Canada has warned that its full service may take 7 to 10 days to restore, though some flights will resume shortly. At least 25 people were rescued and 25 others are presumed dead after a boat carrying around 50 passengers capsized in Nigeria's Sokoto state, that according to its National Emergency Management Agency. Authorities blamed the accident on overloading and poor infrastructure, while rescue efforts were hindered by strong currents from a nearby dam. And Somalia has recorded over 1,600 diphtheria cases and 87 deaths in 2025, nearly double the 838 cases and 56 deaths in last year, amid severe vaccine shortages. Health official Hussein Abdikar Muhyiddin warned that hundreds of thousands of children remain unvaccinated as US aid cuts, including from the US, hamper the response. But we start as Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has said that it was clear at the US-Russia-Alaska summit that US President Donald Trump and his team sincerely wants to achieve a long-term and sustainable peace in Ukraine. Lavrov said that the atmosphere at the Putin-Trump summit was very good. It was clear that the head of the United States and his team firstly sincerely want to achieve a result that will be long-term, sustainable and reliable. That from Lavrov as he spoke to Rossiya 24 state TV channel. Lavrov contrasted what he said was the constructive US position to that of Europe, some of whose leaders took part in an extraordinary summit at the White House on Monday with Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky to discuss the ongoing conflict. Lavrov also said that European leaders were focused mainly on pushing for a ceasefire while continuing to provide military support to Ukraine. Let's now take a listen into what he had to say.
Там была очень хорошая атмосфера, и она отражена в заявлениях, которые сделали после переговоров президенты Путин и Трамп. Полезный разговор. Однозначно было видно, что глава Соединенных Штатов и его команда, во-первых, искренне хотят достичь результата, который будет долгосрочным, устойчивым, надежным. в отличие от европейцев, которые на тот момент твердили на каждом углу, что только прекращение огня, и после этого они будут продолжать поставлять Украине оружие. Президент Трамп и его команда, особенно после встречи на Аляске, гораздо глубже стали подходить к урегулированию этого кризиса, понимая, что необходимо устранить первопричины, о чем мы, президент Путин, постоянно говорили. И одна из этих первопричин как раз проблема безопасности России, связанная с тем, что грубейшим образом в течение десятилетий последовательно нарушались дававшиеся нам обязательства не допустить расширения НАТО на восток. Президент отмечал несколько раз о том, что после этих обещаний было 5 волн расширения.
Well, joining us to discuss these latest comments is Ross Feingold, a political analyst who joins us live from Taipei. Ross, it is a pleasure to be speaking with you this afternoon. Let's look at Lavrov's statements, of course, backing the US and thanking them for their efforts and talking about a US push towards peace, but in the same breath also sort of putting down Europe and questioning them in this position. Do you think the Russian stance is to try and isolate the US away from other Western allies?
Not necessarily. This is all very much a work in progress. It's unclear what was agreed to even in the meeting between President Trump and the European leaders. So the direction that Europe and the United States are going as far as do they want a short-term ceasefire? Do they want a broader peace agreement? Would there be peacekeepers from Europe? Would Europe continue to provide weapons to Ukraine? Would all of this be things that Russia could agree? Frankly, this is all very much in flux, so it makes it difficult for Russia to have a strategy to push back against what the Europeans and the US and Ukraine might be agreeing to, since what they're agreeing to isn't even known at the moment. One thing that's clear from Lavrov's remarks is, as many leaders and governments around the world know, is that it's important to say nice things about President Trump. So we see that with Lavrov's remarks, showing his appreciation for President Trump's efforts to bring about some kind of peace agreement.
Yes, Ross, of course, a lot of discussions set to take place. Meetings today that have taken place between Friedrich Merz and, of course, Antonio Costa, another coalition of the willing meeting to take place too. Is the momentum really there now to try and find a lasting peace, or do you see this potentially as just rhetoric?
I would say it's more than rhetoric. There's definitely some momentum, if for no other reason, is that the position of the Trump administration is becoming increasingly clear. Most notably, the decision of the Trump administration that they're not going to provide cash or weapons to Ukraine the way the Biden administration previously did. Trump, of course, has agreed that the Europeans could buy weapons from the United States and send those to Ukraine, but that raises another question: is how open-ended is Europe's appetite to continue spending money on Ukraine? So we see where the direction is going here. The direction is that Ukraine is going to have to accept, if there's going to be a peace agreement, if there's going to be a cessation of the fighting, then Ukraine is going to have to accept that some of its territory is occupied for Russia, potentially open-ended. So that's the direction we're going. You know, how quickly we're going to get there is really just unknown at the moment.
Yes, well, Ross, do stay with us because we're going to move to a related development, focusing on Ukraine, as Ukrainians are responding with a mix of scepticism, resignation and muted hope in Kyiv for talks to end in Washington between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and US President Donald Trump. This as ongoing Russian strikes overshadow any immediate sense of progress. This comes after the Russian Defense Ministry has reported that it conducted a strike on an oil refinery supplying fuel to Ukrainian armed forces groups. Moreover, Ukraine's energy ministry also stated that recent Russian attacks have damaged gas transport infrastructure. The energy ministry also confirmed that Russian attacks on energy infrastructure in the Poltava region caused large fires. Let's now listen into what Ukrainians have had to say.
Як я зрозумів, Росія ніби в лапках хоче миру, якщо ми щось їй там віддамо якісь території, але відповідно, що я і думаю, більшість українців проти цього. І я думаю, що це затягнеться надовго. Це, думаю, війна може бути не на рік, не на 2, не на 5, а на десятки років. Тобто навіть якщо буде припинення якоїсь замороження того конфлікту, вона рано чи пізно знову буде.
Хотелось бы в это верить, но как бы сколько встречались, не видно от этого, чтобы как и есть нас, так и бомбят, как и есть даже и до встречи, и после встречи. Ну, возьмем даже или сегодня, если не по Киеву, то в другие города, в другие населенные пункты то же самое происходит. Я вообще не особо в это верю, что чем-то это поможет.
Думаю, війна точно не закінчиться, але так чи інакше на медійному рівні, на рівні просування нашої країни, на рівні піару, якщо можна так висловитися, то думаю, воно має доволі позитивний ефект, в принципі. Але щодо конкретних дій і розвитку подальшої ситуації на нашу сторону, я не думаю, що це буде сильно впливати.
Мені здається, що мені нічого не дасть, тому що передусім проблема в тому, що це не потрібно самому Путіну. Можна скільки завгодно зустрічатись, але Путіну це не потрібно. Дональд Трамп, я сам не зовсім знаю, що він робить, він є трохи фріком, тому мені здається, що це нічого не.
Well, Ross, thank you for joining us once again and staying with us. Of course, further strikes reported. Did you expect this with ongoing talks towards a ceasefire?
At one level, you could say it's a bold move by Putin because it runs the risk of anger from President Trump, who in recent weeks has started to criticize Russian attacks against civilians. He called out Putin about that previously. So there's some risk there by doing this, or Russia launching these kinds of attacks at the moment when there's so much hope for some kind of peace agreement. On the other hand, that's just the nature of war. They're both sides, whether Russia or Ukraine, of course, during this period when there might be the potential for a peace agreement, they're trying to get the best situation on the ground as possible. And one way that Russia does that is to continue to attack targets in Ukraine, both military targets, energy targets, and civilian targets, and wear down the Ukrainian military as well as the Ukrainian people. So it really comes as no surprise that Russia is doing that at this moment. And we can only speculate whether or not President Trump specifically asked Putin to stop these kinds of attacks and whether or not Putin agreed to do so. But at least at the moment, it seems like there was no such agreement from Putin.
Ross Feingold, as always, such a pleasure to have you on the programme. Thank you ever so much for your time and your insight. Of course, so many developments coming in these diplomatic talks on the Ukraine conflict. We will bring all of those to you. Moving on, and the United Nations says Israel is allowing some supplies into Gaza, but not nearly enough to prevent widespread starvation. A UN Human Rights Office spokesperson warned the shortage is a direct result of Israeli restrictions on aid. The office says nearly 1,900 Palestinians have been killed while seeking food since late May, most allegedly by Israeli forces. We'll now listen to what the spokesperson for the United Nations Human Rights Office, Tamim Al-Khitan, has had to say.
We have seen reports that some supplies are entering, and we have seen that there are some trucks entering with supplies. And when we talk about supplies, we're talking about partly humanitarian aid and partly commercial goods. Now, this is far below the amounts that are needed to avoid starvation. And of course, the use of starvation as a weapon of war is a war crime. And we continue to call on Israel to allow in aid in sufficient amounts for the population to be able to survive.
Well, Israel denies responsibility for hunger in Gaza, accusing Hamas of diverting aid. It says it has increased deliveries, paused fighting at times, and created protected routes. Well, joining us to discuss these comments from the UN, Israel's response, Peter Baum, a foreign editor of the weekly Blitz, who joins us live from London. Peter, always a pleasure to speak with you. Can I get your first reaction to these comments from the UN?
Yeah, his comments were very vague, weren't they? He went on giving the usual propaganda that not enough food is getting in, which is a change from the propaganda of about a month ago when no aid was getting in. And then he went on to say, and of course, but the aid that is getting in isn't sufficient to stop starvation. Well, I've been in touch with people on the ground at the aid distribution centres today, and for your viewers and listeners, I can tell you that so much aid is getting in that the GHF Foundation responsible for distribution has now implemented a couple of pilot schemes in various depots, the first one being in the Saudi area of Gaza, that's what it's called, which is basically a click and collect system as we would get in our supermarkets, whereby the Palestinians in need of aid are no longer having to queue in the numbers they were queuing in, but simply are going into a distribution depot, giving their orders, and those orders will be supplied to them in the days and weeks ahead, as and when they want it, to stop the queuing. So the UN spokesman, typical of someone who he said, we have heard. So he's not even there on the ground. He's no idea what's going on. He's just spewing the usual anti-Israeli propaganda. If he were on the ground, he'd be successful. How the aid is now being distributed and redistributed. And there's one other thing that's very, very important to note. The cost of foods in Gaza has dramatically decreased in the last 6 weeks. Why? It's simply because the UN and Hamas business model has been falling apart. Hamas can no longer get access to the amount of food that it was getting access to by stealing from the aid delivery trucks, and GHF's business model and processes seem to be working. Not perfect by any means, but a vast improvement from what it was when they first started, and these new click and collect centres will definitely exacerbate the ongoing positive processes allowing aid into to the Gazans.
Yes, Peter, of course there have been more steps made by Israel. Initially that GHF aid distribution was questioned, but as I read out earlier, of course steps have been made to improve that. There are times of the day in which fighting has stopped, other methods as well. But still there are reports from the UN, we have to caveat that they are from the UN, but they say that nearly 2,000 people, around 1,900 people have died while collecting aid. Is there still flaws in the GHF system that need to be ironed out, so those are avoided, even if progress is being made in terms of aid access?
Undoubtedly. But let me put a caveat by all that. First of all, those killed, it was very common procedure to promote the idea that all those killed were from IDF troops firing at the Palestinians queuing for aid, when in fact we are now seeing footage, too late to win the propaganda war, I'm afraid, but we've seen footage that it was actually Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad operatives that were stealing the aid and firing at the Palestinians. So the UN's statements coming forth on this, when they're not even on the ground, as the spokesman suggested, he said, we are just hearing reports, really cannot be taken with the credibility that the UN were years ago. They've really lost a lot of credibility during this Israeli-Palestinian process, I'm afraid. And it seems as if, though not perfect, the GHF business model, the GHF model, it is working for the benefit of Palestinians, and it's hoped that with the continuation of the dilution of the Hamas power, that the Palestinians will greatly benefit from this new methodology of providing them with the much needed aid.
Yes, Peter, please stay with us. We're now going to move to another development, and you will be joining us for that. Armenia and Iran have signed a series of cooperation agreements during Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian's visit to Yerevan. Prime Minister Nikol Pashinyan and President Pezeshkian signed a joint statement while the foreign ministers agreed on political consultations through to 2027. The two countries also signed memorandums covering the economy, tourism, education, urban development, pharmaceuticals and culture. Officials say the deals aim to strengthen bilateral ties across multiple sectors and boost long-term cooperation. Well, Peter, we don't have too much longer left, but thank you for staying with us. What is the significance of this agreement, of course, in the wake of other deals being signed?
I've read right through the agreement, and frankly, it's meaningless. There are no financial numbers attached to it. And can you imagine, really, Armenians going into Iran for tourism when Iran can't even water its own domestic audience because it's going through what can only be described as a biblical drought? This was purely aimed for Iran's domestic audience, and for Armenia, it did no harm at all. It keeps a potentially hostile nation on side. It looks good diplomatically, but at the end of the day, it's meaningless in terms of financial benefits to both countries because no figures were attached to any of the memorandums of cooperation, none whatsoever. It was really vague statements by either party that will do no harm to either party's domestic audience.
Peter, as always, thank you ever so much for joining us and providing insights across a spectrum of topics and discussion points there. Now we now move on, and Bill Gates, the chair of the Gates Foundation and co-founder of Microsoft, has met with Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba in Tokyo. After the meeting, Gates said that he discussed key global health activities and about the innovations taking place in Japan. Japan and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation play significant roles in supporting remote vaccine programs in Africa, primarily through funding and innovative financing mechanisms. Japan has partnered with the Gates Foundation to provide development assistance loans for vaccine and operational costs. There are reports from Somalia where an official stated that diphtheria cases and deaths have risen sharply this year in Somalia, and the government response has been curtailed by vaccine shortages and US aid cuts. The US has significantly reduced or halted some of its vaccine-related aid to Africa, particularly impacting HIV research, treatment access, and other crucial healthcare programs. This visit is important regarding aid to Africa in healthcare. Gates, in his speech at Japan Society, talked about providing equitable access to the healthcare around the world. He also talked about dealing with the impacts of pandemics all across the globe. We'll now listen to what he had to say.
Work we've done together in the key global health activities with Bobby, with Global Fund, and the kind of innovation taking place in Japan. The long-time partnership, and he talked about how he prioritizes global health.
While joining us to discuss this meeting and also the words that were spoken, Dr. Satoru Nagao, a fellow at the Hudson Institute, joining us live from Tokyo, Japan. As always, Dr. Nagao, a pleasure to have you. Of course, vaccine rollout, vaccine support and aid in general to areas like Africa, a key point of contention and concern for many. How significant is this meeting between Ishiba and Gates in the face of that global concern?
This is important because Japan's African policy is just revealing from tomorrow. Japan is holding the Tokyo International Conference on African Development. It will happen in Yokohama, the city name of Japan, and it will happen from tomorrow. And Japan will suggest a big project between India, Africa Economic Zone project. So that's why just before this conference, Japan is preparing the many African aid projects and which make African to be the self-sufficient development with other partners. So that's why this is very important timing to express the support of vaccine diplomacy. So that is timing. But at the same time, Japan's intention is very clear. Supporting Africa is one thing, but competing influence in Africa against China. So that's why China has China's meeting. Belt and Road Initiative is not only the project name. The Forum on China-Africa Cooperation is another related conference, looks like TICAD of Japan. So there's a competition. So in this case, why Japan mentioned India-Africa Economic Zone in the new name. Of course, geographically this is the area, but at the same time, Japan wants to seek the cooperation with India. So India joining the many projects, but good one is IMEC in this region, or Africa, there are many diaspora Japan do not have. So that's why Japan want to cooperate with India in Africa. And today's cooperation with Bill Gates is all of the one of the many projects Japan is preparing. But at the same time, strategically in the African policy, Japan want to cooperate with India. That is Japan want to say. That's why one of the projects, this is important.
Yes, Dr. Nagao, unfortunately we are out of time, but thank you ever so much for that insight. We now will be moving on and heading over to North America, where Air Canada's flight attendants are defying a government back-to-work order after the Canada Industrial Relations Board declared their strike unlawful. The airline says COOP must direct members to return, but union leaders insist the walkout will continue until a fair deal is reached. The strike has cancelled or delayed hundreds of flights, affecting nearly 500,000 passengers. Negotiations have dragged on for 8 months over pay, pensions, benefits and crew rest. Air Canada says services could resume today, while the union urges the airline to return to the table with a respectful contract. We'll now listen to what one flight attendant has said.
Our hope is that the outcome will be that our employer will come back to the table and negotiate. We will happily go back to work with a respect.
Well, Vandana Singh is joining us to discuss this as an aviation expert. Vandana, as always, a pleasure to be speaking with you. There are, of course, updates. This situation is evolving. A tentative deal, we understand, is in the process of being agreed. Flights hopefully restarting today. But this, of course, has had governmental inputs, which is trying to speed up the process, but workers clearly unhappy. What's the impact of this dispute on civilians who are planning their holidays?
Absolutely, Joshua, thank you for having me on your show. And again, I mentioned, look at the amount of disgruntled customers over here. Look at the passenger inconvenience over here. Look at the peak season disruptions over here. And as we see, it has taken 8 months, 8 months that the negotiations have been going on, and obviously there is frustration with the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and rightfully so. They are just demanding what is the need of the hour. They are not demanding anything extra, they are not demanding anything less, but they are saying, please pay us for what we do. And it's good that the Ministry of Labor got involved. It's good that the other ministries also got involved, to sort of say that stop locking horns on this and come up with something. But why couldn't this mediation happen before? Why couldn't this be done proactively? These are a lot of questions to be answered. And as I mentioned, it is very difficult now to measure the loss, cost of the lost opportunity, as I spoke about, and it's coming in too little too late, and you have disgruntled employees out there. And obviously, it's going to take a long time now to reposition, reschedule, restaff, reboot, all of that. So it's still sort of a catch-22, because you can't just ask people to resume work without really bringing something on the table. And it's time now that there's a mediator that something is brought on the table, that something is given to them as a reassurance. And I heard the employee just say respect. Respect is a very, very important word here. They have to be respected for the work that they are doing. They cannot just be told, okay, off you go and on you come. It doesn't work like a switch on or a switch off. It has to be respect and mutual respect. And they had 8 months here to really come up with solutions. And I hope there is no knee-jerk reaction now.
Yes, absolutely. Vandana, very quickly, we have around a minute or so left. How easy will it be to bring these operations back? And what will happen to those travellers who have been impacted?
Absolutely. First of all, it's going to take minimum 7 to 10 days or more to bring the operations to somewhat normalize. I say somewhat normalize. They may begin with a few flights, and this is not going to help many customers here. Don't forget, there are at least 500,000 affected daily. There are about 25,000 passengers waiting to come into Canada. This is peak season. This is the end of the holiday season. And as far as the passengers are concerned, it's a nightmare as we speak. This announcement is not going to make things better because there are talks about refunds going on one side. There are talks about rescheduling going on one side. There's talking of alternate airlines where they'll be accommodated. But on ground, nothing like that is happening. You have a whole lot of confused and disgruntled customers. So 7 to 10 days is a minimum, and that too, if they progress at a fast pace and come up with something on the table for these employees, for these flight attendants to breathe easy. This has to happen very quickly.
Absolutely, Vandana. Thank you ever so much for your insights as always. We will continue to bring you developments on that fallout. So many flights and customers have been affected. But that is all we have time for. We'll bring you that and more of the latest from across the world very soon.